excited about this episode. We have the lovely Jennifer Grimaldi on the podcast. She is a literary agent, and our interview was like amazing. It's so wonderful. It is like an hour and a half long. So prepare yourself. Sit down in a comfy chair, or hopefully you're on a long drive to work or something like that where you have time to listen. She shares so many good stories and really great feedback on queries, and looks into the publishing world. So I think you guys are going to absolutely love this one. But of course, we've got our usual things that we're going to do before we get to the interview. I will try to not take up too much time since the interview with Jennifer is pretty long, so I'll try to be quick with my favorite book in the Lit Chit Chat. But my favorite book of the week is Every Stolen Breath by Kimberly Gabriel, and it comes out November 5th, and it is a really well done mystery with a protagonist who has like a pretty clear weakness. She has asthma, and like that's something that like people really struggle with, and if she doesn't have her inhaler she could die, and she's put in a really precarious situation with a lot of attention on her, and something called the Swarm that's like this mob of people who kills people basically, so like they're after her, and like that would be stressful, right? Stressful enough. But Kimberly does a great job of just pulling you in right away, making you really care about these characters, and it's a book that you really won't be able to put down, and I think you guys will really enjoy it. So let me go ahead and read the blurb for you. The Swarm is unrecognizable, untraceable, and unpredictable. Random attacks on the streets of Chicago by a mob of crazed teens that leave death in its wake. It's been 2 years since the last attack, but Leah Finch has found clues that reveal the Swarm is ready to claim a new victim. Leah is the only one still pursuing her father's killers 2 years after attorney Stephen Finch's murder by the Swarm. Devastated and desperate for answers, Leah will do anything to uncover the reasons behind his death and to stop someone else from being struck down. But due to debilitating asthma and PTSD that leaves her with a tenuous hold on reality, Leah is the last person to mount a crusade on her own. After a close encounter with the Swarm puts Leah on their radar, she teams up with a teen hacker, a reporter, and a mysterious stranger who knows firsthand how the mob works. Together, they work to uncover the master puppeteer behind the group. Though if Leah and her network don't stop the person pulling the strings, and fast, Leah may end up the next target. And I guess it was inspired by the real-life flash mob violence in Chicago in 2011. And it is, like I said, just a really, you never want to say like fun read, because it's got some like dark things in it, and death and some really stressful moments, but you will really get behind Leah and want to see her succeed and figure things out and put a stop to the craziness that's going on in her city. So that again is out on November 5th. So go ahead and pre-order that and follow Kimberly Gabriel on Twitter. She's lovely. So my lit chit chat for this episode is about shelving your work. So how many of you have 1, 2, maybe 6, 7 finished manuscripts on your shelf, or, in the cloud, or wherever you keep it, backed up on a couple hard drives? Did you think that when you finished that manuscript that was the book that was going to get you an agent and a book deal? Maybe you queried it and got some feedback of some things that could be changed. There's so many different ways that journey can go, of course, but if you've been writing for a while, there's a good chance you have something put away on your shelf. A finished story, a finished novel that you revised, that maybe you queried, maybe you didn't, but that's sitting on your shelf and you're working on something new or querying something new. I know that I do. I have some plans to go back and revise some things, but I have one, my YA dystopian novel, This Dead World. It's just done. It's finished, and I love it so dearly, but I'm going to let it sit. I struggled with a while after querying it, getting some feedback, because it has zombies in it. I've talked about this before. You guys are probably like, yeah, Rose, we know. It's not a zombie story. It's a human story set in a zombie world. But let's be real, it is. But, I got some feedback from people that were like, zombies are over, dystopian's over, nobody's going to buy this. So I don't necessarily believe that. I think dystopian is still a thing. I think we just don't call it dystopian anymore. And I think zombies are something everybody wants to read always. But I digress. I think the reason I shelved it, though, I thought about it a lot, and I'm like, do I want this to be my debut novel? And I don't know if I do. I love the characters and the story, and part of me goes back and forth on whether it should stay on my shelf or I should bring it back out and try and query it again. But I do sometimes. I just go back and I look through my query and my synopsis just because I miss my characters. This was the first novel that I wrote after coming back really into the writing world. And I think that kind of novel can just hold a big place in your heart. And I think there's something to be said for shelving your work and still loving it. Because I also have one that is shelved that I'm like, this is garbage, this is trash. But sometimes I think about the characters and I'm like, I had a good idea, a good premise. So I think there's something to be said for continuing to write and to learn while you do it, right? Writing gets better with practice, like most things. The more books we write, the better they become. And the more you learn about your writing style, scene construction, building worlds, character arcs, subplot lines, all of that, it all gets better. But I think we should try and be kind to our manuscripts that we've left behind. So don't hate them. Continue to love them and say hello every once in a while. Look through them and just realize what you've learned from them. Even if, like you have one like This Dead World for me that you like, you love, it's ready, but you're just kind of letting it sit and take some time before you go back to it. Love it. Don't be mad that you have all these manuscripts that are done that aren't going anywhere, because maybe someday they will. See, I did that super quick. So now we're going to get into the interview with Jennifer. Jennifer is an agent at Chalberg and Sussman, which I might be pronouncing that wrong, and I apologize. But Jennifer is lovely. Jennifer is closed to queries right now, but I think she's planning on hoping to be open soon. So I know she had like tons and tons and tons and tons to go through. So just get to know her, see what she's looking for, and then follow her so that as soon as she's open again, you can query her and fill that inbox back up. But here we go. Let's go ahead and get to know Jennifer Grimaldi. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what drew you to publishing and being a literary agent?
So, I am an agent at Shelving and Sussman. I've been there for just under a year. I have been working in publishing for longer than that, though. So, for me, it's been sort of an experience of working in several different portions of publishing. I actually started my career as an intern at the agency that I'm currently at.
Awesome.
It's been really, really fun to come back around. But I thought I wanted to be an editor. I thought I wanted to be, I've worked as an editor, I've worked as a literary scout, that kind of lived in a lot of different spaces in publishing. And agenting has felt like such a return to home. Because you get to be someone who works directly with authors, for authors. You get to sort of really dive super deep into the projects you're working on and work on sort of creating a career for an author, for a client, which is such a fun experience. It feels like a really pure way of celebrating books and celebrating authors.
Yeah.
And it's just a really fun sort of experience. And, for me, I got into publishing because I wanted to work on certain kinds of books. I wanted to feel like I was, in some small way, sort of contributing to creating things that are like a net positive in the world.
Yeah.
And it's so lovely to be able to choose the projects I work on. I only work with people who I'm obsessed with. And sort of be able to bring those things to fruition and share those with other people, and I'm excited about it. So it's a really, really fun way of working with books.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I love that you said you only work with people who you're obsessed with. I think that's what every writer wants. They want their agent to be obsessed with them and their book.
Yeah. I feel like that's something that it's so hard. It's something I always try and talk about when I go to conferences and I'm sort of talking directly with authors. But I think that there's sometimes this idea that if an agent passes on the book, it's because it's not good, or because they don't like you, or if I could just get nicely in front of someone, if I could manage to get someone who can tolerate the book, then it's fine.
Right.
But I think it's such a... I've read so many things that are lovely, but I'm not obsessed with them.
Yeah.
For me, I'm definitely the sort of person who talks about a book until I die. I can't work with things that aren't my whole life.
Right.
That I don't want to just bring up to people, that I don't want to talk about. For me, that's often sort of an indicator for me when a book is good, is wonderful, and that I just immediately want to share with all of my friends and tell everybody about it. So it's just like ineffable sort of blind line that something has to cross. It needs to be my whole life.
I love that. I love that because I think a lot of writers get stuck on that line in like a form rejection. That's, like, I didn't emotionally connect with this story enough.
Yeah.
But if you think about it that way, like, you want your agent to, like, want to talk to everybody about your book and be obsessed with it and want to, like, do everything they can to get it where it needs to be. That can maybe help the sting of that line a little bit more if you understand what's behind it.
Absolutely. It's so awful because I hate that line, but I wind up using it a lot. I try not to, but it's often true. It's something where, like, you can't, the writing can be good for something and the plot can be good for something, but I'm just not in love with it.
Right.
And I think the difference between just being okay with something and when I worked as an editor, I used to work as an editor at Grimaldi Press, and I had a lot of projects that I worked on. And Grimaldi was a very eclectic publisher, so we published a lot of different things, a lot of different, handles, and there's things that I loved and there's things that I liked, and that was fine. But the difference between sort of doing work on something and loving something is such an order of magnitude different.
Yeah.
It's part of the thing that drew me to being an agent, because the way I work, the way people work, it's something that can be very extraordinary. Whenever I talk to authors, I'm always saying, an author-agent relationship is like a marriage. You want someone who's in love with you. You don't want someone who thinks you're okay.
Yeah.
or who likes you, or who will go on dates with you. Like, you want someone who loves you and wants to tell people about you, and this metaphor is getting weird, but I think it's that sort of ineffable connection.
I think so too.
That's really important between sort of an author and the client or an agent.
Yeah, I think that's awesome to think about. I love that. So you said you got into publishing because you wanted to work with books, and how did your love of books begin?
Oh my God, immediately. I was always like I was a single mother, only child, so I spent a lot of time by myself, because I spent a lot of time reading.
Yeah.
And this is just, I have this memory of being like 10 years old and telling like these kids in school that I had like X amount of books, like some ridiculous number, and people called me out on it, and then I went home and counted every book that I owned and came in with like a list because it was obnoxious. But like books have always been such a part of my life, and one of the really fun things for me about sort of growing with this industry and sort of learning about my taste sort of as a member of the industry versus, just like a consumer, has been a really, really fun way of being like, oh, you know what? All the things I loved when I was a kid, I still love those things, and I still want to work on those things. So for me, it's a lot of genre stuff. I love sort of magic-y stuff and spaceships and love and like interesting sort of adventure stuff, but that's become, you know, more sort of layered. I still am obsessed with YA. YA wasn't as much a thing when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And there wasn't really like a category for it. But that space is very much the sort of space that I was very drawn to. So it's been, I think there was sort of a period of my life when I was in college and I was like, okay, time to put away childish things. Now I can only read the classics.
I think we all go through that phase as a reader.
I know. And there's nothing more fun than the moment when you give yourself the freedom to be like, well, I'm sure people do love the classics.
Yeah.
But, you know, when you give yourself the freedom to be like, no, these are the things I love. This is what makes me feel something. You know, so it's been, you know, this sort of really organic, fun experience of kind of drawing out, you know, what I love to read, what I love to work on, and sort of what kind of things I want to pull into the space and pull into the world. And one thing I always find really fun is to say, you know, when I'm reading a book and I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, I would have been obsessed with this. I am obsessed with this. And sort of knowing that there is that sort of being able to connect. That's something I love so much about YA, is knowing that you are connecting directly with like teens.
Yeah.
And being able to, you know, sort of be the first, you know, fun trope that they read, or the first time they sort of experience these kind of like amazing things that shaped who I am, who they are. But I mean, all of my personality traits are like directly descended from whatever books I've read. So I know who I am.
Yes, and I love it. I love that this is like your love of books is, and all of that. I mean, it's your job. You get to just love books and champion them, and that's so wonderful.
Yes, it's the best thing. I think that it's part of the reason, you know, sort of going back to why agenting, why I fell into that, was because you just get to, you know, I work on a fairly broad selection of things. I have my genre things that I love. I have sort of sweeter things and darker things, but it's all this kind of, you know, it's things that I'm obsessed with against sort of a lot of different genres and a lot of different spaces. So it can be something where I'm like, I'm going to work on this book and that book at the same time, and it's so much fun, and I can bounce between two things. So for me, it's always a love affair. That's publishing for me.
I love it. That's so amazing. Well, let's get to the questions that I know a lot of people love to listen to you guys talk about as agents. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about queries for a little bit. So my first question is, do you think queries need to stick to the specified formula? So this isn't like your agency's submission guidelines, but that overall specified formula of just an intro, who, what, why, the stakes, and, you know, keeping it clean and simple.
Yes. So this is, I always find this is like the weirdest advice to give for publishing, which is such a creative industry. But yes, the formula works. I think, you know, for me personally, and everyone sort of goes through queries in a different way, but for me, a query is just a way of sort of hitting my interest or hitting a red flag. So I will often start reading through a query. I know where to find the plot and the bio, and I'll skim it really quickly. And whenever I hit something in the query that's like, yes, for me, I always request pages, and I'll go straight down to those pages. So it's, for me, knowing where everything's going to be streamlines the process. I know not everybody knows, like, the exact correct template, and that's fine, but when I'm reading something that is a little bit more complex, or someone's trying to do something different, but someone doesn't really know what the standard is, it just sort of bogs me down a little bit. The way I think of it is that you have sort of I get a lot of queries. I'm close to queries now, but like when I'm not, I get a lot of stuff in, and I only have so much brain power to read like every query. So my hope is, the best thing is that I start reading the query, I go, yes, and I go right into the pages. Mm-hmm. And then you've got, that much attention, and whatever attention I didn't put on the query, I'm putting into the pages.
Okay.
But if I'm reading through the query and I'm kind of like bogged down with it and I'm trying to figure out what's going on,
yeah.
because I've done something clever,
yeah.
then I get to the pages and I'm already like, oh, I've got like 2 lines in this, you better allow me. So it can be sort of a you know, it's like, I've got so much vacuum. That not being said, I mean, you know, obviously you love something, like I'll sit there and just read the whole thing. But I'm someone who I want to be sort of taken with something. I want to be entranced. I want to be like, oh, yes. So it's sort of this, it just makes it easier. It's kind of like stamping a template on something. It's like putting, you know, nutrition facts on the back of a food item or whatever. Like you look at it, you're like, okay, it's not got, you know, 1,000 grams of whatever, so we're fine. And it's just kind of this way of getting through to the next thing. For me, my process of queries is I usually go through everything that I have and sort of pull out the things that are obvious no's for me, things that have red flags or things that are not things that I represent, or things where something about the language really sort of rubs me the wrong way, which sometimes can be, you know, very aggressive, or certain folks are like a little bit, you know, intense.
Yes.
In that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I pull all those out and then I go back through it again. So it's kind of like, for me, the query is like this way of getting to that first step. So I can just like shuffle out all the wheat from the chaff, and then I go back and I'm like, okay, now I want to read all this thing and decide, like, is this something I'm going to be obsessed with?
Right.
Which is tough. It's a tough sort of weird metric, because often, you know, you'll read something and you'll be like, I like, but will I love it?
Right. Do I want to tell everyone I know about it?
Yes, absolutely. You think that's a joke, but it's not. I really do.
Yeah. I do the same thing with books that I love. I like need to tell everyone I know about it.
Yeah. I think, you know, part of that is also sort of thinking, I like to think of it in terms of, you know, how many books does the voracious reader read, and how many books will I just keep telling people about? Just not that many. So, like, I'll read a lot of stuff. I'll read things that are, you know, in the published space, not as much as I want, always, but, you know, I've got this, like, horrible mounting to be read pile.
Tell me about it. It's so bad.
I just carry them around with me, and I hope, like, by osmosis, something will happen there. But, yeah, I mean, you know, I read a lot, but there's not a lot of stuff where I'm sort of buying extra copies and shoving it into my friend's hands and telling them to leave without reading it. And it needs to be that level for me, and that's a really hard bar to surpass.
Yeah.
So, this is all to say that for me, being able to stick to that very traditional query formula, you know, to have sort of that intro paragraph that tells me, you know, what the book is in a line if you can, you know, that middle 2 or 3 paragraphs of plot with as few names as possible, so you don't, like, sort of bog anyone down.
Yeah.
And then sort of that last paragraph of, like, here are my prompts, and here's the send-up, and here's where I sent it to you, maybe, and here's my bio, and, like, that last 2 paragraphs, and then that's it. I know to sort of skim through that, and you can sort of put the prompts in different places, and, you know, you can shuffle things around a little bit, but I know where to expect to find everything, and that just makes it easier to sort of shuffle through your query and be like, okay, like, because queries are a weird art. They're not the same as writing a book.
No.
At all.
No.
And I'm not expecting anyone to be good at writing a query.
That's good to know. That's great to know, Jennifer.
I mean, it's honestly a large part of my job is being able to take something and write my own pitch letters when I send down a submission, and knowing how to be able to, you know, take it and make it concise and snappy. I know how to do that. I don't know how to write 100,000 word books. So, like, we're good.
Right.
We're on different angles here. But, so what I'm looking for is kind of keywords. I'm not looking for, you know, for me, it's oh, I love this concept, I love this person, I love this thing, this sounds really cool, and then I'll go into it.
Yeah.
I know I'm not everyone is 100% like this, but for me, I will read as much of the query just to see, and I don't want to be spoiled for it, which is ridiculous. But, like, you know, it's very much like I'll just skim through it, make sure there's nothing, you know, very reprehensible in there, and then I'm like, let's go. I want to be taken. So for me, you know, the first pages, the reason I always request first pages is because that is so much more monumentally important for me than the query.
For sure.
So, I mean, I know people sort of stress out about it, and it is hard to do, to sort of be able to distill your you know, your novel into 3 paragraphs. I mean, I'm just like giving plot synopsis. But for me, it always has a means to an end, which is why I like having it just be in that formula.
Yeah, and I think it's the point you made about how your process, you know, you like to know where everything is. That's something that I think writers maybe don't think about when they're sending it out, because they want to stand out, you know, they want to be the one where it's like different, so then you pay attention, but that could actually harm them if you're like confused about where everything is or what is even going on in the query. So I think that is definitely a good perspective on it.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's a lot of fear of this idea of, oh no, my query will get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah.
But I read everything that comes into my inbox. You know, sometimes folks will send me things like more than once, and I'm like, I read it. The first time, we're good. I promise you, I did read it.
I got it.
Because there's nothing, you know, for me, getting into querying is exciting.
Yeah.
Every time, because I want to love the thing. I want to be obsessed with the thing. So it's not, you know, I honestly, like, the best query letters that I've gotten are the ones that, like, hit me the best and make me read the book. Like, they're not necessarily, you know, standout queries. It's just that I was able to sort of read in between the lines and say, like, oh, I can see where this is going. Yeah. That's not to say some of them aren't fabulous, but, like, I think it's very much sort of this, I will read the thing. And I think for me, sort of the hardest thing is when you've got something, you know, clever or funny, or, you know, not that that's a bad thing, your book is humorous, but, you know, I've gotten things in that have sort of made, like, a little joke about me or my name or whatever, and, like, you're wasting your own time by making me, like, read this joke about my name, whereas I could be reading about your book. Like, I'm good. Like, I don't need you to tell me, like, how cool I am. Like, I want to read your book. I want to know how good you are.
Right.
Which is not to say that's not useful, you know, for someone to say, like, I'm reaching out to you because X. But I think, you know, there's this sort of line where people are like, I've got to flatter her, so she reads the thing, and that's not unnecessary. I'm gonna read the thing you sent, and I'm going to try and sort of hit it as well as I can. So this is a weird way of being like, query letters are very important, but also not important.
Right. But I mean, I think that's a good perspective, like, because writers, I think, freak out, and I'm terrible at writing query letters. It's like the bane of my existence. But like you said, it's very different from writing, you know, 100,000 word novel. Because we don't spend our time writing 300 word little synopsises. We don't. So I think maybe, you know, just the idea of keeping it simple and short and getting the main point across, and then having, you know, your actual work, the book, be the one that stands out and is, you know, what is going to make you obsessed.
Yes. Yeah. And for me, the best kind of query letter is just describing the arc of the book.
Yeah.
That's kind of why I said, like, don't put character names in it, because, I mean, I don't need to spend the mental energy processing, like, the different character names. Like, obviously, put your main character in there, but I've read query letters that are like, here's the name of the town and the place, and this is cow, and I'm like, I don't need So it's just, you know, being able to sort of describe the arc, describe the themes is really cool. Not a lot of people can do that, but if you can, that's really awesome. And sort of the same piece. I think it's difficult, especially because, you know, published books, the copy on a dust jacket is very different from what clearly is. So it's hard to be able to sort of find something that is good to eat. And I think what winds up happening is people are just sort of reading other people's career letters and trying to sort of fall into that space, and it can be very difficult.
Yeah.
But honestly, I think it's sort of this, if you can describe the arc of your book, if you can describe sort of the, the impetus and the tension, and if you can't, A, you may need to take a minute away from your book, or B, that might be a really good indication of, gosh, maybe there isn't the strong enough sort of impetus here that needs to be kind of worked on.
Yes.
One thing that I often wind up doing is when I'm working on something, I'm reading something past a query letter, I'm reading the manuscript, and I'm loving it, and the way I sort of know I love it is I'm sort of starting to get ideas for how I want to do the pitch letter, and I start writing things about like how I want to phrase it.
I love
and that's such always yes, and that's always a great sort of indicator of, for me, like, oh, I know how to describe this book. So I think, and often for me, if I'm struggling to do that, it's an indicator that there's something sort of that I'm missing on like a page level that I'm not really, there's something subconscious that's not working.
Yeah.
And it's often a nice way to sort of pull that out and say, like, oh, that's the issue. The issue is that there's no X3. Got it. And it just sometimes that can be a really helpful tool in that way as well.
I think so too. I've definitely come across that where, you're trying to write a query letter and it's like jumbled, nothing's really working. And for me, once on one of my early novels, I was trying to write the query letter and like I couldn't figure it out, and then I realized, I was like, oh, there's something wrong with my plot, like my novel itself, so I need to go back and fix that. That's great. Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah, it was great.
I mean, I think sometimes people sort of think that the query letter needs to be like a moment-by-moment plot synopsis, and it doesn't. So I think, being able to sort of know your book in that way, and sometimes that's sort of a way of disconnecting yourself from the project a little bit, which is always, I think, very good to be able to do, especially when you're starting the submission process. Now I'm going to go off on a tangent, I know this. I can feel it in my heart. But that, when you send out your project to someone, the agent is going to do, well, most agents, I think, at this point, do editorial work on it. I certainly do.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a process, and it's going to be time, and then you're going to sell it to someone, hopefully, and they will do work on it. So it's very much like, this is going to go through a lot of stuff.
Right.
And sort of being able to, of course, to love your work, but be able to handle that sort of criticism and work on it and sort of flex it and have that sort of a little bit of distance to being very precious about it is, I think, a really good thing, and something that, setting it aside for a minute and sort of figuring out how to do it in an objective way sort of takes this. I talk a lot with my clients, a lot of people, about sort of this idea of art versus saleable art.
Yeah.
You're creating something. And the thing that you've written that is beautiful, and the scene that you've written in the paragraph and all that, versus, okay, now we have to make it commercial.
Mm-hmm.
It's different. There's a sort of a wide gap between those things. So I think it can also be a really nice way to sort of, walk in that direction a little bit.
Yeah.
Writing is a very lonely process until it's not anymore. And then it becomes a very collaborative process.
Yes.
So I think, sort of figuring out that direction, I think can be really a good start.
I think so too. I think being able to like look at your book and say, okay, this is the book of my heart. It has my blood and tears in it, and step back and be like, oh, I'm stepping into like a business side of it, and need to look at what I'm going to have to do to it to make sure it sells, because it's different.
Yeah. It's very different, and sometimes you can write something that's wonderful, and art, and that is not something that is, publishing.
Yeah.
I think that's something that happens, sort of a lot sometimes with, going to conferences, and, you'll meet people who are like, this is, a memoir of, my father, and it's this beautiful story, and it's all that, and it's like, that's art that you've created, but maybe not this art.
Right.
So it can be something where, I think it can be also difficult to sort of believe in your creation and put your heart into it and say this is good, but also no in the sort of businessy sense. And I think that's kind of the helpful sort of marriage component of agenting as well.
Yes.
Where, I can sort of be the person who's like, well, industry-wise, I don't know. I mean, I like your idea, but I don't know if that's right for your career right now. I don't know if that's right for the place that you're at. So I think having that sort of, outsider perspective of someone who, again, is obsessed with you, can be sort of a nice way to kind of be able to do that.
Yeah, someone who can hold your hand and say, okay, I'm obsessed with you, I love you and your book, but here's what we're going to do next to make it a little different.
Yes. Yes. And I mean, I honestly don't know of many books or many pieces of media that I have loved and not thought, well, this thing isn't great, but I love it. Yeah. It's just, like there's never a media that you consume that's perfect.
Right.
Ever. And, so I think if it's this space of like, aha, I can see from the outside perspective how to shuffle things, but that doesn't mean, that I'm not totally obsessed with you. But I have gone off on a tangent and I know it.
That's totally fine. I love tangents.
All right. I'm very much shuffled away from the query space.
We're good. Well, let's get back into it. Let's talk about those query red flags, or like those query no-nos. What would you say is like your top query no-no that you see?
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of times there's this. I do get in some queries that are very, like I said, kind of aggressive or negative.
Mm-hmm.
That's always a big red flag for me. People who are saying, like, this is a great book and you're not even going to look at it.
Oh.
Or like, all these other people pass on it, but they're idiots. And I don't, like, it's things like that for me, are immediate red flags in terms of, I'm not going to get on with this person.
Yeah.
Just no matter how good the book is. If I read something like that, someone's like, I'm very special and no one loves me, and I'm just kind of like, I'm not going to read your book. I don't want to work with you. I mean, for me, I love books. I love projects. Obviously, I'm an agent, and I make my money off selling books, and it would be cool to work on books or sell. But for me, the very first thing I'm always thinking is, like, is this the person I want to represent? Is this the person I can work with? Is this, so sort of having that, politeness, just general, if someone is in my inbox, like, passing that bar is always the first step. So that's always, like, the biggest no for me. But outside of that, it's stuff where, it's stuff I don't represent.
Yeah.
Or I don't necessarily mind people saying, like, I'm not sure this is something you represent, but it feels like it's within some of the things you talked about. Like, often that's a no, but, like, it's not necessarily, and I appreciate that they've, looked me up or know what I do. But, yeah, stuff where it's, just projects that are absolutely outside of my range. That is sort of a no-no for me. But I feel like those aren't the sort of things that are necessarily happening from your audience. So I'm trying to think of things that are sort of more specific in terms of, okay, if you have, the query sort of structure set. And I think also not stalling within that structure can often be a little bit difficult for me. I don't reject things out of hand for that.
Yeah.
But it's just like a little bit more of a struggle. And I do know that there are some people who really dislike obvious spelling errors and getting your name wrong and like that kind of thing.
Yes.
I have this really awful memory of the first job I ever applied to in publishing, writing a thank you letter to the wrong name. And just that horror where it was like, I know this person is, and I screwed it up. So for me, it doesn't matter so much. I'm willing to overlook that, unless it's like, to whom it may concern. So like, if you like mistype something, like, it's cool, I'm not throwing out your work because you've done that.
Right.
So I understand that, like, going too far. But some people are really, really, really very specific about it for good reasons, I think. So I think, just being sure to double check and make sure that you're sending to the right person. I think also something that helps with that is not sending to 1,000 people.
Oh, yes. That's not a good thing to do.
Yes, I think we can often tell when something is, I send this to 1 million people, or something is, I specifically selected this for a reason. I think it can be nice to have, I think that's something that's often, it's not really a no-no for me, but something that I just glaze over is if there's a line in there that someone has told them to tell me why they're interested, but they haven't got a real good reason for it. So they're just like, I like you because you said you like, quote, books. And, that actually is worse than not including anything at all. Right. I would rather not have anything in there and just assume that you sent to me because you read my bio, you liked it, you connected with that. Because that's my assumption off the top of my head is that you're sending to me because you like me, or because you like the stuff I worked on, or because you think I will be a good partner for you. So stuff that's just, well, this is the line where I do this. We also haven't talked about comps, one of my favorite things to talk about.
Yes.
Comping to books that are ridiculous, or it can often be sort of a bad thing. That's another one of those things, like queries, I don't expect authors to be very, very good at comps. But one thing that's very helpful is sort of reading a comp and saying, like, okay, this author has read in the genre, knows a book that has come out recently,
right,
and been thinking Harry Potter. Like, those are, good things to sort of be able to indicate that you're thinking in a sort of publishing forward way, a business forward way about your book, which I really like. So when you have the other side, the flip side of that, when you say, this will be like the next Twilight, it tells me, that, like, I obviously always, reach for the stars for your book, but that doesn't mean anything to me.
Right.
That tells me that you haven't read a book in 20 years, or that maybe you don't know the genre at all.
Yeah.
I think it's just, that's something that is often sort of a little like, I don't know, about that. But I mean, those are sort of like little indicators for me. I keep like a weird sort of mental checklist in the back of my brain where it's kind of like, okay, 1 is fine, 2 is tough, 3 I'm going to go.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's sort of this balance where every time I open something, I want to look. And every time I read something, I want to believe in it. And sort of being able to balance that. And sort of that's, I think, sort of my little internal art versus availability, where it's, I want to love the art, but also I need to know sort of where my time is best spent. Because I want to spend all of my time with the things that are wonderful, the things that can really bloom.
Right.
So those are a couple of things.
I love those. My next question is, what things, we already talked about in a query, so what things in first pages, once you've gotten to that point where you're like, okay, I like this, want to see more, what things when you're in reading first pages will make you stop reading?
It's a great question. I think I become a lot harsher when I go to first pages, because sort of that's the craft. That's what I'm expecting. And especially within first pages, I know those are the pages that have been read over and over and over and over again. So I know that for most people, those are going to be the most polished of the things that you're sending out. Things that will stop me from reading, stuff that's just straight dialogue, sort of awkward because of sentences, things that feel like there's certain very sort of tropey openings that sometimes I love tropes. Yes. But, like, there's certain openings that, I'm not going to be 100%, like, excited about when I start reading it. There's been, for whatever reason, one of the cool things about being an agent is you get to get this, like, sort of sense of, this is the thing that's very happening right now for the opening of books. And there was a time when I was getting, like, all of these books, the opening started with, like, someone teaching the main character how to fight with a sword.
Yes.
Like the sixth time I read that, I was like, oh my god, this is so boring. Because it was just a way of, and that's not saying that they can't be an interesting opening, but for a lot of times it's often this sort of, here's a way to describe the character without actually sort of getting me into it. I want something that's going to sort of snag me in completely. And if I read through the 5 pages that I get, I almost always request it. Because that's something where I just like haven't stopped, wanted to read, wanted to keep going.
Right.
And then I know that's something that's sort of for me. So it's often, it becomes a checklist of things where, similar to when I open a book in a bookstore, or a library, like, okay, are you trying to get me? Like, are you pushing me in, or is this kind of placeholder information?
Right.
So, depending on the sort of project, it's character voice, it's plotting, it's, sort of this description, it's writing, sort of can you construct these sentences? So that becomes, for me, like, as I said, with the queries, I have sort of my, like, little mental, like, once, twice, 3 times. For reading queries, it's not the same for me at all for reading actual books. Because once I start reading the book, if I'm off, I'm off.
Yeah.
So it's often, if you're not rereading your first pages, you should be.
Yes,
because,
definitely.
Yes. Because that is so quick to sort of turn me off. And I think that's something that's true of the first probably 50 pages of the book, that I think, at any point I can just pop out and just say, like, yeah, this isn't working, it's not going anywhere. And often, if you can get past the pages, or if I can sense something that's wrong or interesting, like a different kind of character, that's why often I think having an opening where it's like, this is what I look like, and this is my normal day at whatever, before the incident starts, is not as interesting, because how do I know what's exciting about your book? I'm sort of opening this page, and I want to be transported.
Right.
So I think, you want to open with an inciting incident, or, it's always like, people always sort of give advice for this, which I think is good, is to open in media res, open with something happening. And then, if your character is, a thief, have them be stealing something. Like, don't open it with them telling someone that they're going to steal something, or, like, living their normal life. I think a lot of times people feel like they have to set the stakes for something before it gets ripped away. But if you're writing it the right way, you understand what something happens, how it feels.
Right.
And I think, a great way to do that, and to sort of see how you should be starting your books, is to read your favorite books. I mean, read very widely in the genre, always, but open your favorite book and see how it's done. See, sort of where you get into. There's just not a lot of books that open with, well, this is my normal life, and do it in a way that's compelling.
Yeah.
Unless, you're saying this is my normal life, but your normal life is, like, very strange and sort of out of the ordinary, and you're kind of getting wrapped into it in that way.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of those nice things that it's like, okay, in that first query, you post out your comps, and you said these are your comp titles, and they're books that have come out in the last couple of years, and they've done well, and they're in your genre, and then hopefully you've read them, but, like, open those books and see where they start and how they hook you, and be able to sort of put that, understand where that is. And I think I'm a sort of an editor at heart, I think, always. It's my first job, and that's, like, where I live as a person.
Yeah.
And I'm always sort of like, all right, let's cut this stuff out. And I think oftentimes, having that backstory and knowing about it will inform your characters and the way you write them, and you just don't have to put it in.
Yeah.
So a lot of times I will cut, the first couple chapters, or cut things from the beginning, because it's, for me, I almost always find it unnecessary in first drafts, or in the drafts that I take on from clients, because it's hard to know sort of what stuff is important. So there is a part of me that's sort of mentally in the back, like, okay, I can cut this, but sort of, I guess my always way the other way that I know that I'm liking a book and the way that I know that I want to work on it is that I start editing it. Which seems like sort of the other way around, right?
Yeah.
But if I'm reading something and I start saying like, oh, not this line, or this should be like that, we got this paragraph, then I know I'm like invested enough in it that I know that I want to work on it.
I love it.
Yes, so I mean, I often when I get in a certain level into a book, I'll just start printing it on paper because I'm a dinosaur and I do all my editing by hand. And then I type it up, and that's excruciating for everybody. But I'll start making these changes, and then I know, like, oh, this is something I really want to work on. So I think it's this case of, the early pages being sort of the strongest indicator. Sometimes I get queries, and people will say, I know you asked for the first 5 pages, but I sent you pages starting at page 25, so that's where it gets really exciting.
Oh.
Then your book should start there.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So I think, it's this sort of, if you are pacing in your first 5 pages and you're like, but it doesn't really get good until page 10, then it should start at page 10.
Yeah.
So I think it's sort of this, for me, it's am I getting swept up in this?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, a lot of the stuff that I love is genre stuff. Not all, but a lot of it is. So I do love historicals and sci-fi and fantasy, which means there's a lot of world building that goes on in those pages. And I know people sort of struggle, okay, how do I put this world building in, but not make it just world building, which can be very boring, very info dumpy. And I think, I have like a little bit of more leeway often for that kind of thing. But because I read so much of it, and I'm very well in this genre, I know how to do it well. So I think it's this sort of case of, being able to move right into your story. Your character's emotional arc should be immediate to me. I should already be invested in what they're doing. I think, you have, like, the certain books that just sort of have very wide world building, like the V. Schwartz, like, Shapes of Magic books.
Mm-hmm.
Very intense world building, but I think the very first scene is just Landlord's doing something, if I recall. And I think because you're, like, immediately, like, pushed into this universe. Golden Compass is a book that I always reference because it's my favorite book forever. But, that is a book, those books, things like Material Series, have just a lot of intense world building, but I think it's always such a masterclass in seeing how you suck someone right in because it's a character study. There's other stuff going on, but it's a character study. And Celebrity Justice is a really wonderful sort of sci-fi, intense world-building saga, but it opens with the story of a character seeking vengeance, and you don't need the rest.
Right.
Because you know what's going on. Like, this is a character who's like, I'm going to get vengeance for something, and you're like, yes, I'm with you. Who are you? So I think it's often about starting that book with, your character, your arc, your gist, getting me on board, because I'm not going to get on board by learning about your character's life. I'm going to get on board by learning about your character's motivation.
Right.
So I think it's just sort of make it intense, make it happen. And a lot of that is often, writing the thing. I think you often have to write it out and then erase it.
Definitely.
So you can sort of have it out there. You know what that's happening. You know what the day-to-day is, and then you can just kind of start where it starts. Start where the story starts.
Yeah. I think, too, beginnings are something you hear so much. Don't do this, don't do that advice about.
Yeah.
And I find to myself, I always start, like, when I have an idea, I always start, probably 50 pages past where I actually need to begin it. So it's the sort of thing where I kind of got to backfill and then figure out, okay, where should this actually begin? And I think I know a lot of other writers who, their ideas come to them kind of not at the exact beginning. So it can definitely be hard to know how much background info and all of that. But yeah, you definitely don't want to be bored or just like info dumping right at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's sort of a good good indicator is if you were telling this story to a friend, like if this was your story and you were genuinely telling it, like where would you start it?
Right.
Would you start your story by saying, okay, the day before, I was in my house and the chicken was loose, but you wouldn't, like you'd start it with like, and then the invaders came in and destroyed our home. So I think it's kind of this sense of, you know, knowing what is necessary and what isn't.
Yeah.
To kind of try and balance these things, which can be very tough.
Definitely.
I think also, you know, I think also there's, again, like some leeway in that space. Like I don't expect like perfection, but I am at that point, you know, this is your craft, you're an artist, and I want to be sucked into your space.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I love it. I feel like we've already talked about like what your favorite things to see in a query are.
Probably.
I think so, right? Like, I guess if you could summarize like one, like your, you know, I mean, I guess, you know, you kind of told us your process and like what gets you excited. So, so I feel like
I skipped ahead. I love it.
Yeah, I love it. But I guess we'll end our conversation about queries on like what your tips, like number one tips or golden rules for authors who are querying. What would those be?
I mean, I think first of all, if you are, even if you don't write it out, if you're struggling to come up with a reason why you're sending to someone, don't send to them. I think it should be sort of, I think being able to send to people that you're excited about and people who want to be your partners, I think it's a very sort of complicated process because in some ways I think authors can feel like petitioners.
Yeah.
But it's really about you sharing something with someone who would be lucky enough to take you on as a partner. And I think it's really important for authors to remember that their work has value. And, you know, you shouldn't be sending to just sort of a wide selection of whomever. It should be, you know, people who you would genuinely be really excited to work with, because that's what you'll be doing. And I think, you know, that is always my number one thought, like right off the gate, is that, you know, making sure the people that you're sharing your work with are people that you want to share your work with and people that you're really excited about, because it's sort of ignore everything else I said about, you know, this is boring and this is whatever. Like, authors are artists, and the work you create is amazing, and, you know, all of the writing that's in all of the stores is from people who, you know, just were writing things on their own, and that's not always the case. Sometimes there's connections, sometimes people know each other, but the vast majority of it is just stuff that someone said to someone else and they were obsessed with.
Yeah.
And I think sort of knowing the value of your own, you know, sort of thing that you've done, and that's something that I always find, you know, it comes across, I think, when people write a query letter, and they're like, this is good, though. And I think having that confidence in your own work, I think, is so very important. And I think also, you know, just, I guess, you know, in terms of reading, you know, sending out the query letters, like, make sure you run it by other people, you know, make sure that your prompts are good, make sure that it makes sense, you know, ask if you have critique partners who aren't your friends. That's always the best because they can be very honest with you.
Yeah.
I feel like critique partners should never be your friends.
No.
No. Because, you know, you can get someone who will say, like, this actually doesn't make any sense. And then sort of be able to kind of get that process. But I think if you have your arc, you have your story there, you're very excited about it, you want to send it out, you know, those are all the best things that you can do. I know it can feel very sort of isolating. You send it out and it's just out in the world. Our agency policy is that we don't respond to queries that we're not actively considering, which, like, hurts me emotionally a little bit.
Yeah.
But I just don't have, if I spent the time to reject personally every single thing that came in, I wouldn't be able to read as much as I do. So it's just kind of like like every time I get something in, I want to be like, I want it. I promise. And I can sort of understand how awful it is to send something out to the void. But, you know, if you're sort of sending to people who you respect, who work on things that you love, who, sort of are people you think are good partners for you, then you have that safety net of knowing, like, they are considering what I'm working on. Then this is happening for them, it's going into their spaces, and they're sort of considering it. Those are sort of two very vague pieces of advice, but I think that's sort of a good way to... Those are the two most important things, I think.
I think so, too. I think that a lot of writers, querying is like the bane of their existence, and they're like, okay, let me just send this to 50 agents every week just to, like, get it done and get it out there. But I think putting in the time and effort to research, to really find agents you would want to partner with, who could be obsessed with your book, while that takes so much more time, is definitely worth it. Because then you just spend less time. You waste less time, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the sort of last thing you want to do... Oh, and I will say, this is not a sort of related to what you said, but another piece of advice in the query process. If you send your work to an agent and an agent offers on it and you have a call and you don't feel super comfortable with it, do not sign with that agent.
Right.
This is very much like it's a marriage. It's a marriage. It's someone who's going to be representing your book. This is someone who's going to be talking about your book, who's going to be framing your book, who's going to be choosing who to send it to. You want someone who gets you and gets your book. I think it is far, far better to send it out, get an offer, and say, no, thank you, than it is to sort of work with someone who doesn't 100% get your vision. And I think that's, in some ways that sort of translates to, what we do linger when we send out on submission, which is that I pick people who I think would be good partners for the book, who can make the book successful, and sort of passing that along. And I don't want to just sell the book to, like, a rando who's going to throw it in a pile. I want to sell it to someone who's going to love it and appreciate it and, try and make it the success that I believe it can be. So it's sort of the same thing. You don't want to just send to a million people. If you are feeling like, oh, God, I'll just send it to 50 people and then I'll be done and then I'll just look at the next thing. That's not, that's not having the confidence in your own work.
Exactly.
If you are feeling that, maybe that isn't something you should be sending out. Or maybe it still needs to be workshopped. I think it should always be something where I am so excited to tell you about my project.
Right.
And if you're not at that level, got to figure out what's going to get you there.
Yeah.
Although I know that's where I'm at all the time, and that's like at 11. Not everyone's at 11. I never want to go out with something that I can't just call someone up and be like, are you sitting down? Because it's going to rock your world.
Right.
And I think you should feel the same way about your own work if you can.
Definitely. I love it. Those are good pieces of advice. So you mentioned that call, for you, when you're on that call with authors, you've read their book, you're in love with it, you're obsessed. What else do you look for in that conversation? What else are you looking for in that potential marriage partner?
I think first off, it's about sort of connecting. I think people can be a little bit nervous about the call, but they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
It's about seeing if my personality matches with your personality. It's, making sure that, I almost always, I think always, I could honestly just say always, have editorial edits that I want to make for the project. I always have a vision for what I want the project to look like. And, I'll get on the phone, I'll tell people about myself, what I can do, why I'm obsessed with them, and then I will go through my vision and say, like, these are the things I think, we can change. How do you feel about it? And it's often, people need a minute.
Right.
But, I think making sure that person is on board. Because I don't ever want to work with someone who just says yes, and then doesn't actually want to do the thing I'm doing, and I'm taking their art and just kind of smooshing it in the wrong direction. I want to both be on board with what we can do for it. So I think it's very much, these calls are always love that, kind of. I think, writers are people who a lot of times are very introverted, And it should be very much, I'll get on the phone and be like, okay, I love you. What was your inspiration for the book? Why did you do this? And it's, you passed all the book hurdles for me, and now it's just, are we two people who can work together?
Right.
And I think it really needs to be the same way on the other side as well. It's, how that very silly thing that people tell you when you're interviewing for the first time and you're like 18 and they're like, you're interviewing them as well, and you're like, haha, no, I just want a job.
Yeah.
But no, you really, really, really are, and it's your chance, there's a lot of really great questions floating around the internet that you can ask agents. There's tons and tons of lists that people have written of, here's 50 questions you can ask an agent. And so they're looking online with people and they'll be like, oh, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, no, please ask. I want to answer.
For sure.
I want to answer all of your questions. And if you are on the phone with someone and they're like, I don't want to answer that, that's a red flag.
Yes.
So I think, you should be prepared to be able to ask these questions that that you're comfortable. What is their vision for the book if they don't tell you? Where do they want to send it to? How do they see it? And, it's often, even if you're not, 100% aware of every imprint that exists, it's really good to get a sense of someone saying, here's a big 5 imprint versus, I don't know, the small press, I guess, or I'm not really thinking of anybody. And then that your book is in good hands. And I think being able to ask these questions, what made you fall in love with the book? They'll probably tell you. But, just being able to sort of have this back and forth conversation. I mean, I don't, if you get off the phone with someone and you're like, I don't know, then probably not great. You'll be talking to this person for a long time.
Yeah.
A lot of time.
Yeah.
And, it's just, it needs to be something that I think both people feel, which is why I always call it a marriage. It's very strange. It's very much sort of that dating situation. What's the value of first date? Know really what they do for a living? Not really. It's just to sort of know, your values align. And if this is something where, you have a theme or you have something that you're something that's very important to you about the book, to know if someone's going to highlight that or not, that can also be really important. So I think it's just sort of this very back and forth, it should be interviewing. And again, that goes back to, understanding the value of your own work. That this is someone who's going to call you and say, I'm so excited about the possibility of working with you, or so excited about the possibility of talking about your book because I loved it so much.
Yeah. And I think a lot of writers, they, getting a literary agent is oh my goodness, the best thing that could happen, So I think there could be that, you mentioned, if you're on that call and it doesn't necessarily feel right, but, so don't sign with them. I think a lot of authors could be like, well, what if this is my only chance to get an agent, But I think, I think writers, and me included, we all need a little bit more patience because publishing takes a really long time. So I think that's a good note to remember. It is, you want to interview them, you want to have just kind of a back and forth, a good talking relationship to be able to work together and have a long-term thing together.
And honestly, there's a lot, especially now, because there's a lot of options, I think, for people, a lot of different agents out there, a lot of different presses, silver presses, a lot of different options, and I think people feel like, oh, I missed my chance.
Right.
That's it. But if you're getting the chances, if you're getting the full request from Yelling Call, and you're getting the call and you're not connecting, it means you're moving forward.
Yeah.
It means, someone is connecting to your work.
Yeah.
And you are so much better off, getting one call from a person saying no if you don't feel it, or if, the direction that you want to take your career is not the direction they want to take your career, writing your next book, going out with it. Now you have experience with a call. Now you know what is happening. It shouldn't feel, if you're thinking this is my only chance to get an agent, well, what about when your agent sends it out to publishers? Do you want to say this is my only chance to get a publisher?
Right.
Do you want to, this is my only chance to have a cover? This is my only chance to have one book out there?
Right.
Every time I work, I offer a representation on the project just because I believe it will be successful. I, like many agents and commission-based, I only make money when the author makes money. And that is also a question that you can ask and make sure that you're aware of
Right.
what the policy is with the agent you're talking about. If they ever ask you for money, that's a scam.
Yes, definitely.
But, so for me, it's I'm not going to invest my time in something I don't want to make a success. So it should feel like the person you are talking to wants to make you a success. And if it's just, sort of more chum in the bucket, then it's then that's not the best way to showcase you. Publishing can be a very slow and not industry. It can be very weird. You can publish a book and publish a book at the wrong press, but the press doesn't know how to sell it. It sells like 10 copies, and then, well, what do you do for your next book? What do you do for your career? You're sort of already in this hole.
Right.
So I think it's this way of making sure that your work is highlighted as best as it can be. So, I don't know.
I love it.
Important point to me.
Yeah.
Always be in love with your agent as they are in love with you.
Yes, it's just a big love fest. You want everybody to love. You want your agent to be obsessed and love your book. You want to love your agent. You want your agent to love you. Everybody needs to be in love.
Yeah. You need to feel comfortable. You need to. I think a good indicator is sort of if you get off the phone with someone and you think to yourself, if I had a problem, would I feel okay calling this person?
Yeah.
Because you should.
Yeah.
And if you don't, then, it's sort of something to think about. And, just sort of be aware, well, for communication styles that don't match with mine, very, very much, totally interview them.
Definitely. Have your list of questions ready to get to know them.
Yes. And if, you get stuck on the spot and you're not sure, you can email them after.
Yeah.
I always tell people they can email me, and they never do, but you can.
So right now you are closed to queries. I saw that you just had a lot of things to catch up on.
I do.
Perfect. Well, my question, normally is what is on your manuscript wish list right now, but maybe let's say what is on it for the future, for when you are open to queries again, some people can prepare what they want to send you.
Yes. I am closed to the moment because I'm horribly behind.
Yeah.
And this is a tragedy. It's my whole life, always. But for me, I sort of have kind of a wide range of the things that I work on. I talked a lot about sort of the genre stuff that I love, but I'm also very into historicals and rom-coms I really love, romances. For me, it's often something that is in the heart of a book, the emotional heart of the book, outside of the packaging.
Yeah.
Which I think for me is one of the things that I am always so drawn to sci-fi fantasy, is because it's often you've got all this elaborate stuff going on, but the heart of the book is sort of this way of explaining certain emotional truths that are sometimes more difficult in other spaces. So for me, that's sort of like this found family space, or this sort of moving past certain things. I always say it's a very complicated sort of thing to talk about, but I always love the sense of someone sort of not an issue book way of doing a trauma, but sort of like someone who has had sort of emotional difficulties in their life, who is moving past that, who is growing because of that.
Yeah.
I think that's often something I find very compelling, is not, how did this ruin me? How am I a different and just a strong person?
Because of it.
And yes, because of it. One of my favorite books that deals with trauma, it's sort of a weird one, is this book called The Goblin Emperor. It is a high fantasy about this kid who is like the 10th in line to the throne, and everyone else dies and becomes king. And he there's all this political intrigue going on, but in the heart of it, it's about this kid who has this past, who's trying to do his best, and it's got this beautiful emotional heart to it. And it can feel very much, like there's a lot of trappings, but it is my favorite kind of genre book, where it is all about this emotional arc.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's sort of a very beautiful thing, and something I always really deeply connect to. I'm always sort of interested in books that like sort of reflect the world around me and things I feel seen in. I'm very much always kind of like rattling the cages for sort of non-binary and trans leads, because that's something I'm really personal to me, and I really want to see more of that, and again, not in an issue book way, in a this is just a character way,
right.
Especially in the YA spaces, because I think sort of it's so much fun to work on these characters, to work on normalizing this, and, you know, people have lives, and I think for me a lot of that is also this sort of moving through trauma spaces. These people have lives. You know, the kids are these things, and it's good to see yourself reflected and still
for sure.
Yeah, I'm very happy to see, you know, just like a cool assassin, badass, and then there's other stuff. But like, I think, you know, for me, it's often this sense of sort of fun and adventure and sort of dealing with the world around us through different lenses that is always really exciting to me. And I'm also very interested in neurodivergent voices and sort of diverse voices and sort of being able to create, you know, to work with people who are making something of the world that actually exists. That always is something that's very exciting to me. I try not to play favorites, but whenever I get anything that like hits certain things, I'm like, oh, I am going to read all 5 pages. I just want to know. I just want to love this. I mean, you know, sort of outside of those, like, very broad strokes, there's certain things that, for me, certain, like, tropiness, like, I, you know, will always be a sucker for a good heist.
Yeah.
I love, you know, like, we were in living on bed in the inn trope.
I was going to mention that. I saw that in your bio, and I was like, that's everything I love in a book.
Yes, I know. It's such a good trope.
It is.
Oh no, maybe they'll be snowed in.
Yeah.
And how for worms? What now? It's very compelling.
Yeah.
I'm many of my generation a child of fanfic. I grew up on that. And definitely still read them.
Yeah.
So for me, you know, being able to sort of work within those tropes is always just a huge delight for me. I love a good love story. I love a good dark love story. I love gothicness. I think that can be really fun, really dark, really interesting. I love sort of more quandaries. I am always down for robots. I recently have finally gotten into reading the Martha Wells Murderbot series, which I've not read in the past, and they're so good because so much of it is kind of this such a really fun main character, but it's also sort of this, you know, who am I? What's my personhood in this space? Which is a great metaphor for a lot of things. So I think, you know, there's certain things that I'm like, I love noir. I think there's certain things that I think, you know, will always, when they come into my space, I'm like, oh, I love this. Shouldn't have. Thanks. I'm also, you know, always like a big fan of retellings of things.
Yeah.
I think that when you have, oftentimes the reason why a story is passed down, the reason why a story lives in our consciousness for so long is because of the kernel of something that just sticks in the craw. And I think, you know, I'm not necessarily interested in, like, a play-by-play of, you know, a retelling, but now it's in France, or a retelling, but, you know, they're all raiders or something. But, like, you know, I'm interested in something that is talking about or transforming that sort of kernel of what was it about this story that was so compelling, how can we retell it in a way that is, you know, sort of more modern or more connected to whoever you are. That's something that's, for me, always a huge obsession. if an author's really obsessed with something, because you can always tell.
Yeah.
I would read like a dictionary if it was something where, you know, I've read books where people are like, I'm really obsessed with antiquing, and I'm like, me too now. Totally. I think the reason why something like, you know, Hamilton was so very successful is not because people are excited about Alexander Hamilton, a not very well-known founding father, but because Lin-Manuel Miranda was very excited about Hamilton, and you can read that in every single line of that. And I think when you've got something that someone is, people's weird obsessions, I love reading about them. I love it when someone knows a lot more than I do about something, and I get to sort of fall into that. So it's always really fun for me when someone's got like a weird job, or you know something really well, or you used to be a ballerina in a past life. And I think it just really gives a lot of information to the characters and into the plot. And honestly, you know, I think every writer has these things that they want to tell about themselves through these stories, and I think it can be really, really wonderful to sort of reach out and connect with that. So that's something that I always get really excited about. I've got a lot of weird stuff in my bio. Also, like, I like city planning. I do.
I know. I saw that. I was like, that's great. City and urban planning.
I like the way I'll get like a query with someone who's like, I get it, and I'm like, thank you.
Yeah.
There's something I always know. I can always get really excited about a good map.
I love maps. Maps like make my life when books have them.
I love a good map. I always like, you know, like I'll open a book and then I'll just sort of pour over that, even though I don't know what anything is. Yeah. I got a good sense of it. You know, there's nothing that excites me more than like a map with a purpose. I love something with, you know, something spooky, something with too many rooms, something with too many limbs. One thing I tweeted about sort of recently was this sort of like horror as sort of emotional catharsis that has become very popular in a lot of movies and TV shows recently, like The Babadook or The Haunting of Hill House, which are sort of these stories about emotional situations told through horror. Which I love. Yeah. Love. Yeah. And I think that's also sort of this way of, you know, transforming something, you know, transforming this emotional truth and making it more visible in certain ways. Sometimes if you can shift the lens a little bit, you can see something so much clearer. And that's part of the reason why I'm always drawn to these sort of genre trappings, because it's often a way to, like, sort of share these emotional truths. And then sort of by the other token, in like my rom-com space, I want like unbelievably sappy love stories. So, you know, sometimes we just kind of make these connections. And I do, you know, for me, I think there's a lot of really fun tropey stuff that I'm obsessed with, and I think it's so much fun to sort of work on these fun tropey things through lenses, through things that aren't as sort of widely sort of out there in the publishing space. Recently, this year, the Red, White, and Royal Blue came out, and that was like such a fun book. When I saw it, I emailed one of my friends at St. Martin's, and I was like, please, I want a copy, please. I was like, that it, like, let's work it on, and I was sort of like banging on the doors. And telling everyone how great it was. But this is such a fun, unbelievably tropey, exciting thing, and it's really fun to connect to it. And I definitely, you know, love something that, you know, is fun and is sucky and is lovable, and also I love the fact that it's queer. So I think that there's something really fun about working on that kind of thing. Yeah. Being able to tell these tropey love stories. For people who haven't gotten a chance to be able to tell these tropey love stories. So that's something that I get really excited about. But it's very much, you know, as you can tell, very broad list. Which I love. I think a lot of it is, that's why being an agent is awesome. But I get to work on all these different things. And I think it's all united by this sort of emotional core of being able to tell, you know, these true arcs, tell these true stories, whether or not, it be like you're like a vampire or whatever, but you're still telling this emotional story that is deeply personal, which I always love.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think, like, when you were mentioning how you can tell when an author is, like, obsessed with something or has, like, a cool hobby, I love when you can be connected with an emotional core but still learn something from a fiction book. That's my favorite. When I come away and I'm like, oh, I feel like I know a little bit more about something that I would never have looked up before in my life.
You know what? Honestly, this is my sort of standard for books these days. Is I want to have come out the other side different.
Yeah.
And that can be in a lot of different ways. That can be middle grade books, and it can be fun tropey books, and it can be, seeing a love story or seeing a horror thing that like sort of reveals some part of you. I think, every wonderful book does that in some way, transports you, changes you. And I think that, being able to have something, as you say, but that there's an emotional heart to it. I loved Six Exposed, which is, at this point, I guess, an old book, kind of. Very obsessed with it, and I didn't really know a lot about Grimaldi. I hadn't read any of her books before when I read it. I think after the very end, and there's an author's note there where she's writing about how she's disabled herself. And as soon as I started reading that, I was like, oh, I knew this. I knew this in my heart because of the way you've been writing this character. I knew this character hit me the way they had because you knew this in like a deeply emotional way. And this is something that meant something to you, so it meant something to me. And I think that is such a wonderful thing to be able to, A, see out in the world, and B, be able to connect to. My books are so wonderful and transportive, and I want every different kind of book because they, make you who you are.
I think so, too. I think, I love that you have a wide variety of things, and, like, I just love that your focus is, like, on that emotional core, and, like, you love all the different kinds of genres that could get you there. Like, it doesn't matter what's really, for you around it. Of course, you want to like it, but, I think that is cool and can definitely sound fun. You get to work on you could work on like a super romantic story one day, and then a horror story, then, fantasy. That would be super cool.
Yes, that is me. I am in some ways very eclectic, in some ways very the same. And I think, it's just sort of a really beautiful thing to be able to work on a lot of these different kinds of things that are sort of telling stories in different ways.
Yeah. Well, do you have like a timeline when you think you'll be open to queries again, or you don't know at this point?
I am crossing my fingers that at the end of August, early September, I'll be open again.
Okay.
I don't want to set a strong date on it because last time I closed, I set a strong date on it and I wasn't ready, and I did it anyway, and that's why I'm still in a hole. So I want to be able to actually be able to read all the wonderful things I have. I have such wonderful, great things that are sitting in my inbox that I have not gotten a chance to read, and I want to give them that chance. And so I will be tweeting about it as much as I can to sort of keep updates on where things are going, and hopefully, I'll be able to project the time.
Perfect.
That is my severe hope.
Yes. Well, we want you to take as much time as possible so that, because I can't even imagine the amount of queries you get and then the amount of fulls you have to read. That's just a lot. So take your time.
It's a lot, but it's fun. It's fun. It's work, but it's fun.
Yes, it's work, but it's books. So, that's pretty great.
Absolutely.
So my last question for you is one of my favorites. It is, what is your favorite book right now? This is not your favorite book of all time by any means, just a book you've read recently that you really loved.
See, this is terrible terrible question.
I know, I'm sorry.
My favorite book of all time is always just the book I have read the most recently that I liked.
Oh my gosh, I love it.
So I'm going to sort of circle back to this, the Murderbot books. I just started reading them, and they're incredible. because that's like my whole life now. And it's, that's something that I'm really deeply enjoying. I've started this really lovely series, which I think is completed now. I'm sort of catching up with a lot of stuff. But Sarah Beth Durst, I think it's the Queens of Mensa, the series. The first one's the Queen of Blood. And it's this really fun, wonderful sort of not very tropey epic fantasy about this girl who thinks she's destined to be able to do something, and kind of is. And it's this really lovely sort of like slip on the head of kind of dealing with what does it mean to be in the situation? Who is the kind of person who's going to get through these things? Sort of what. It's just a really interesting conversation with a lot of the different genre books that I've read recently.
Yeah.
But gosh, it's so tough. It's terrible. I'm looking at my bookshop right now, and I'm like, oh no, there's so many books here.
Well,
I haven't mentioned any of them.
It's like I can read sometimes like 3 books in a week. So to pick a favorite, sometimes I'm like, I don't know.
I don't know. It's just the books that I've given to people the most recently.
Yeah.
I am, let's see, what else have I read recently? I've read the graphic novel, the second book of The Adventure Zone, which I'm obsessed with, which is a very, 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 very charming podcast-turned graphic novel, which is all like D&D and improv-y based and hilarious and wonderful, beautifully illustrated. And I have those sitting in front of me right now, and I've read them like 3 times now. I have a beautiful stack of YA books that I'm about to get to but haven't read yet, so I can't even talk about them, even though I read like 5 pages, and I'm like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I just think there's a lot of really exciting things going on, a lot of really exciting books that are happening in this space. And I think, it's often just whatever sort of floats across my page is often where we're at. So it's a lift.
I love
I've been reading a lot of queries lately.
Well, that's good. You should be reading queries to catch up on that.
I know.
Well, good. I know that's such an unfair question I ask at the end, and people tell me that all the time. I'm like, I know, but I want to hear what other great books people are reading, because I read so many. I have just like this ginormous list of arcs to read, and then I have my library books and like this huge stack by my bed and another in the living room. But, I always want to add more to it, so.
I know. It's just like, it's really super duper tragic how many books I'm like sort of in the middle of reading right now.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And which books I'm like always very obsessed with. And I do this very terrible thing, which is when as I mentioned, when I love a book, I share it. So whenever I finish a book and I really loved it, I give it to someone else.
I love it.
I don't even have like books in front of me to sort of reference.
Yeah.
I'll get off the phone call and I'll be like, oh, right, yes, this book I just gave away to someone else. I love that. But yeah, I mean, it's so much fun to be able to sort of read in a lot of different spaces and kind of get a sense of a lot of different things that are happening.
Yeah.
And, kind of try and keep track of everything that's happening out in the publishing space.
Yeah, which is, not an easy feat.
No.
Jennifer, thank you so much for chatting with me today and giving us wonderful information about querying and what to look for in an agent. I am so appreciative of your time.
Yeah, it was so lovely chatting with you.
And another literary agent interview on the books. Jennifer is so lovely. Please make sure to go connect with her, follow her, and watch when she's ready to be queried again, because she's lovely and so lovely. Again, thank you guys for listening and for sharing. Please continue to share the podcast and what you've learned with your friends and other writers that you're connected with. And follow me at Rose Quinney, QUINNY, on Instagram and Twitter. I'd love to connect with you, hear about your favorite books, what you might want to share with a Lit Chit Chat or talk about in a Lit Chit Chat. That would be so cool. And you guys will hear from me next week.